Today we are going to talk about elements and trends in land governance. In this course, we are trying to explain what land governance is and what are the multiple elements that make up the term land governance. So, to understand the different elements of land governance, we must first understand what is considered land governance across different contexts. A commonly cited definition of land governance says that land governance concerns the rules, processes, and structures through which decisions are made about access to land and its use, the manner in which decisions are implemented and enforced, and the way in which competing interests in land are managed. If we juxtapose this definition on results from a recent bibliometric analysis of the world land governance across 24,000 publications on land, we can observe that land governance basically defines an overarching concept dealing with the political economy that makes the granular elements of planning, making laws, creating and enabling institutions, encouraging participations, and reducing corruption possible. Thus, today we will try to understand and historicize the overall trends in land governance by focusing on a few key developments across the five elements of land governance, namely policy framework, legal framework, institutional arrangements, participation and accountability, and transparency and corruption. If we analyze the policy framework of land governance, we see that historically, land governance has primarily been concerned with assessing and collecting revenue from land rather than conclusively defining types of landholding and the rights and liabilities of each landholder. From the earliest records of history, land administration history in the country, we can decipher that land and the resources yielded from its cultivation have been the primary source of revenue for the state. And each successive clan, king, and imperial power has passed on detailed knowledge about how to increase revenue via taxation and resource management. However, aspects like security of land ownership and an individual's inalienable rights over land were never clearly defined. This does not mean that these rights do not exist at all at the level of local communities. But the state only chose to recognize and formalize with legal sanction those practices that were beneficial to itself. It is only with the coming of an elected government post independence that the state recognized the undercurrent of exploitation in this approach and attempted to rethink land as a means of employment and wealth creation for individuals rather than as a revenue generating source for itself. The result of this massive policy shift is still seen in the fact that property tax today, especially in rural areas, amounts for a really small percentage of the overall revenue of the state. At the same time, the state is investing more resources than ever before in creating conclusive land and ownership data. Now, speaking of the legal framework, another element in land governance. Given the socialist leanings of the first democratically elected Indian government, it focused a lot of attention on land reform policies meant to improve the socio-economic conditions of small and marginal farmers. The first 5-year plan in 1951 classified agrarian classes into intermediaries. Intermediaries were landlords who had hereditary leases to collect revenue from on behalf of the state. Then there were large owners and small and medium owners. After that came the tenants at will and landless workers. The new policy aimed to abolish the intermediaries and redistribute land at scale among existing tenants, creating strong tenancy laws to protect the rights of prospective tenants and landless workers and limit the amount of land an individual can own to prevent future consolidation of land. So, since land is a state subject, and under the constitution, the policy was implemented via tenancy and land ceiling acts in each state, which were different. Most states rewarded tenants who remained on tenanted land with ownership rights either by payment of a predetermined price to the state or by paying compensation to the landlord. However, these acts had multiple loopholes, which often created additional disadvantages to the small and marginalized farmers. The provision for the right to resumption meant to encourage non-working landowners to become cultivators, instead enabled landlords to evict their existing tenants and sharecroppers in the name of personal cultivation. On lands where direct resumption wasn't possible due to land ceiling laws, tenants were coerced into declaring voluntary surrenders of their tenancy rights. It also had the cascading effect of pushing all future tenancy agreements into the sphere of informality. Similarly, the implementation of the Land Ceiling Act also had mixed results across different states. The mechanism for acquiring surplus land from owners and giving it to landless marginal landholders lacked transparency and awareness. The law provided enough exemptions for benami or fictitious transfers, deliberate miscategorization of land use, long delays in the legal process, and many other issues, which made the legislation largely ineffective. While some states like West Bengal have made considerable progress in implementing the law, most states today have instead chosen to amend it to allow industries and non-farmers to buy large parcels of agricultural land for non-agricultural uses. Another element of land governance are the institutional arrangements. By the 1980s and early 1990s, we saw a marked change in the state's relationship with land and its occupiers. With emerging liberalization of the Indian economy, the state assumed the role of facilitator rather than as an interventionist. The impact of previous land redistributive policies was called into question from within the government, and it was decided to shift focus instead towards creating conclusive land records that can prevent further dispute and conflicts. The Centrally Sponsored Computerization of Land Records Scheme, or CLR, launched in 1985, which later became the National Land Records Modernization Program (NLRMP) in 2008, was meant to institutionalize the process of land administration. While CLR was mostly focused on just digitizing of older land records, the NLRMP was also focused on creating a new system of maintaining and updating land records using the latest technology. The ultimate goal of these schemes was to strengthen institutions that deal with land. Today, the scheme has been rebranded as the Digital Land Records Modernization Program, or DILRMP, with an increased focus on digitization at all levels of service delivery and the use of GIS and satellite imagery for new surveys. New schemes with similar focus have also been launched for previously unsurveyed areas like Abadi area under Swamitwa. Another aspect of land governance is participation and accountability. The era post 1990 saw the passing of several acts which sought to balance the overall need for easier market access to land with the upliftment of marginalized communities through their better participation in the decision-making process. Some of the seminal legislations during this time were PESA, or the Panchayats Extension to Scheduled Areas Act of 1996. Although tribal land was already protected under the 5th and 6th schedule of the Constitution, PESA was instrumental in making the process decentralized, as it mandated the Gram Sabha and the Panchayat play a central role in approving land transfers and sales. Then, the second act that created a huge impact in terms of decentralizing was the right to fair compensation and transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013. Tabled in the Parliament in late 2011 under the UPA government, the bill recognized for the first time that the social benefits from the state facilitated development initiatives must be carefully weighed against the associated social cost. Under this bill, there was an emphasis on prior and informed consent, a progressive compensation mechanism not just for individual landowners but for all stakeholders reliant on economic activities associated with existing land use patterns. Another act, a seminal act during this time, was the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Forest Right Act of 2006. Popularly called as the Forest Right Act, the FRA was passed to correct the injustices caused by the colonial era forest laws that prevented local communities from using forest resources. It recognizes the right of forest dwelling communities to cultivate land and common property resources. It also gives these communities the authority and responsibility to conserve biodiversity and use the forest sustainably. And finally, the last act we will speak about is the Hindu Succession Act, or the amendment in the Hindu Succession Act that was passed in 2005. While the Hindu Succession Act of 1956 was the first law which sanctioned absolute property rights to women, it did not give them birthright to ancestral property. The 2005 amendment made daughters and sons equal co-parents and thus equally eligible to inherit ancestral property by birth. Although passing of these acts mandated the creation of many decentralized institutions for different marginalized communities, defining the scope and functions of these institutions was left to the discretion of each state. These led to a fractured implementation of acts like PESA and FRA, resulting in those institutions having barely any power in practice. Similarly, despite the progressive amendments for the co-parency in the Hindu Succession Act, Less than 3% of women are listed as joint owners in property records. Most of the landowning women acquiring the land through marital families, especially as widows, and not through their paternal families. Thus, legal amendments by themselves have proved insufficient in undoing the power structures that limit women from asking for their rights. Another aspect of land governance that we have to talk about is the transparency and corruption. With the change in power in 2014, we saw a focus on improving transparency, especially in urban transactions. The Real Estate Regulation and Development Act, RERA, passed in 2016, established regulatory authorities in each state to educate the unregulated and non-standardized practices in the real estate sector and bring transparency for buyers in the sale and purchase of real estate. The period also saw states using data from existing schemes like the Land Records Modernization Program to create direct citizen-centric services like being able to apply for partition, mutation, purchase of digitally signed copies of many types of land records online. This is to be followed up in the future with ULPIN, a unique land parcel identification number, a code assigned to each individual land parcel in India after collating all available records about it. In conclusion, tracing the trajectory of land governance is complicated, as the term contains different elements, each of which tell a diverse story of how land relations have been governed. However, if we look at the stories together, we can see a larger pattern of political economy emerging. The radical socialist ambitions in land policy of the early years post independence were tempered over time with the acknowledgement of limitation in its implementation. This acknowledgement led to a series of progressive amendments and acts meant to decentralize the implementation mechanisms in the early years post liberalization. However, the federal character of land governance in the nation, coupled with increasing market pressures on liberalizing land access to new stakeholders like industries, ensured that decentralization to the level of communities was effectively sidelined in many states. What followed with the coming of the new government was the shift towards use of technology as a solution to institutional defects. With the rise in climate change, climate action is already becoming important and one of the crucial aspects in future land governance. This will undoubtedly affect how we use land as projects involving renewable energy like carbon credits, solar, wind, etc., will create new stakeholders and therefore possibly new conflicts. In this moment, it becomes imperative for us as a society to rethink land governance through a new lens that balances human rights, economic opportunities, and environmental sustainability. Thank you.